Here we go.
Here we go.
You've never done anything like this before.
No.
Neither have I. Well, then I think that all that's left to say is welcome to Lent. My name is Baird Linke. I am a pastor in Montana, in a town called Bonner, and I'm joined with Ellie Dieringer.
Hello, I'm Ellie Dieringer. I am a layperson, just a young adult who's passionate about finding out ways that we can care for each other and for our communities better and having conversations about that.
And we are going to be the people guiding the conversations with our wonderful contributors, the bloggers who are going to be writing about Lent throughout this whole season, talking about how ELCA young adults are going into this Lenten season with a real eye towards taking care of creation, thinking about how our spiritual practices, the things that ground us in our relationship with God, with one another, with ourselves, also have implications for the way that we relate to the earth and the priorities that we have for addressing climate change, environmental destruction, the way that we interact with this ecosystem that we sometimes imagine ourselves, I think, to be a part from in,
hmm
instead of a part of. Ellie, I'm wondering to start this off if you want to talk about what your experience is growing up with Lent. That was a part of your life growing up, what that looks like for you this year.
So Lent was always like a season I was aware of. Ash Wednesday was always, it was like a midweek service, which was exciting and it felt like a special day. And I'm a connoisseur of the puns of like, get your ash to church. It was very funny to joke about that, like in middle school, especially, and still now. But I remember it always feeling very somber.
Mm.
And there was kind of this air of like, I had friends who were really intense about giving something up. I had friends who had some pretty strict rules about what they could eat and what days of the week. And that wasn't necessarily something that was typical in my family. I think we had more conversations about what are some things we can take on. Um,
Mm.
and now, kind of, as I've been grappling with my own faith and what the seasons of the church year mean to me, my understanding of them, the why behind, um, why you might take something on or cut something out, and, what that kind of points your attention to. It's been interesting to say the least. I will say this is kind of the first time in my life that I've tied Lent to specifically care for creation or thought about those things as potentially being intertwined. Um,
Mm.
and I think that is a great thing. Um, and I'm really excited to continue like having these conversations and learning from other young adults who are taking action and being really thoughtful and um, sparking conversations about all these intersections of how to be in the world and what it means to engage with a season such as Lent.
Yeah, I'm excited that you are coming at this with fresh eyes. This I've been involved with No Plastics for Lent for a while, so I'm really pumped that you get to be here and helping to shape that for folks who maybe have never engaged with No Plastics for Lent or for whom the idea of like linking creation care and spiritual practices might be a new concept for them. It's great to get to bring people into that. Did that feel like a natural fit to you, or was that something that you took a beat to say, I like both those things, but I don't see the connection between them?
I think it's a shift away from being like, what am I going to give up for Lent?
Mm,
Plastics. Great, good choice. Versus thinking, it's not just what am I giving up, but why am I engaging in this practice? Or what does
hmm,
this mean? Yeah, in terms of like stewardship and creation care and community care and having a focused period of time where you're being maybe a little bit more structured about the ways
hmm.
that you set yourself up for success to build these habits and to think more critically about the way that we interact with the world, the resources that we use. So it's not so much that it felt like a foreign or mismatched kind of two different concepts. It's more of that movement away from the the what to the why, and bridging
Mm.
that beyond just this period of time.
I really like that. The difference between the what and the why, that those are I mean, those are linked things. Hopefully, what of what you're doing hopefully has a why behind it. But I think we can sometimes really move through life without paying attention to that. The fact that there is a why behind this what, and that as I've been studying about Lent to get ready for the season and becoming a pastor of what role this plays in the church calendar, in our life together, the why has always been more interesting to me than the what, because so many different communities have different responses to that why. Like, so many communities agree preparing for Holy Week is really important. This is
Yeah.
the chief celebration of our faith. The thing that is really distinct about Christians is that they believe that Jesus rose from the dead, which is like that's an Easter thing. And so getting ready for that, trying to get in the headspace there, experiencing it emotionally, both the like what's at stake in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and then how we respond to that in our daily lives, 2,000 years removed from that historical moment. It's so interesting the ways that people have chosen to respond to that responsibility. Do you remember growing up, like what was your most ambitious thing for Lent, whether it was giving something up or taking something on? Does anything stand out to you as a maybe getting over your skis a little bit?
Yeah. I think at one point I maybe in like high school I was like, I'll give up coffee for Lent. Quickly regretted it.
And
Well,
so
yeah,
did everyone around you.
yes. Yes. Yeah. Um, yes. Well, and what's funny is I remember rationalizing it of saying, I knew I was planning to go to like my summer camp, obviously months later. And when you're at the camp, only counselors had access to coffee. And I was like, I'm gonna have to get used to not having coffee every day. So this will be like a good practice run. So even then it was like a strategic weaning off of caffeine.
Mhm.
And so again, my why wasn't very strong. And I think thinking back to my childhood and the conversations that I had with like neighbors or friends who I remember asking like, well, why are there only certain days where you can have fish or like no meat? Like, why are Sundays exempt? Um, and hearing back like that's just what we do. Or even
Mhm.
hearing back like that's what it means to be a good Christian. Um,
Oh,
or like to follow the rules, when it's more restrictive or
yeah.
driven by shame or, versus like that was a frustration I always felt was I couldn't understand why. Um,
Mm.
and then I struggled to find my own why when I was kind of arbitrarily selecting these things to take on or to cut out.
That is interesting. The way that I think when we're young, especially, and we haven't had the person to sit us down and explain the why behind it beyond this is just what we do, or you want to be a good Christian, right? Which I've never found to be in the long run spiritually fulfilling or fruitful advice to give someone. I
Right.
was in college at a Catholic school, so Lent was like a big deal at this Catholic school, and I worked for their Catholic campus ministry as like the token Protestant on the team. And we were getting ready for Lent. I was like, I'm gonna really bring my A game. I'm gonna show these Catholics, like Lutherans, we can do some spiritual practice. And so I gave up hot showers,
Ooh.
and yeah, not not pleasant for sure. And though my skin was gorgeous by the end of it, my pores, uh, and I decided that I was going to try to like pray monastic hours
Oh,
where
wow.
there were these like set moments in the day where you'd be set aside to pray. And one of them was like 3 a.m. And as a as a collegiate athlete, as a student, as someone with a job while doing that, 3 a.m. turned out to be not the time that made me very holy. I wasn't I wasn't behaving in the rest of my life like I was getting closer to God after getting up
Yeah.
at 3 a.m. to pray every night and then doing everything else that I was expected to do. And I remember my spiritual director talking to me like, this was ambitious. How's it going for you? And explaining to him Yeah, it's hard during the day. I'm working on it. And also I've noticed that I'm not proud of how I'm behaving, but that's okay because I'm putting myself out there. I'm trying to grow in this way. And he quoted, I think, Teresa of Avila to me, and said, "Yeah, the saints who've really dedicated their lives to really rigid holiness, one of them said the first step to holiness is like a good night's sleep." And I do, and I think that was Teresa of Avila, and that's become a bit of a motto since
Yeah.
then.
The things that stick with you, you know?
Really, yeah. And
Oh,
that has made me, I think, a more I don't know about holy, but certainly a more generous or patient person if I'm thinking about like, if the way that I want to treat people depends on a good night's sleep, I should probably prioritize that in a lot of ways.
just maybe. Well, and
Hmm.
it's, thinking about that question of why, or, what are the rules we follow because we think that they'll, make us more holy, or it's, what we've been told to do. And, hearing from, other kids my age who are the ones telling me like, oh, that's, makes you a good Christian, or that's the rules that we follow. They were figuring it out just as much as I was. And like, I think that process of like growing up and figuring out what resonates with you. I remember one thing I always loved about Lent and Advent in my home church growing up is we would have Wednesday night soup suppers, and I'm a big
Yeah.
fan of soup. And it like, it kind of evolved for me as this is a delicious meal, and then we go and maybe do like hold an evening prayer, which I always loved, just like the music was very familiar. But then over time, we'd start to have like intergenerational conversations at the soup supper tables,
Mm.
and there would be, a theme and a focus and integrating more like art and creative expression as spiritual practice with those like Wednesday night services, kind of that midweek check-in. And I think that is what really deepened my understanding of, oh, like we're here in community to have conversations that matter with people who have different life experiences, who are at different phases in their life, and to relate to creative expression in a way that's meaningful. I think that's all kind of what deepened my relationship with Lent.
Mm.
Um, And I'm still kind of figuring out that specific why for me or what it is that I want to do. Um,
Yeah.
but remembering kind of those first experiences as an adolescent and as a young adult now of what is it that sticks with me? What is it that feels moving and not just I'm doing this thing to suffer for the sake of suffering
Right.
because that'll somehow make me, better.
Right.
Yeah.
So you talked about how that experience of being in a relationship in intergenerational community, in talking about these different expressions of faith, the like soup, which is always a selling point. Uh, what to you connects the value of like creation care with your experience of yourself as a person of faith in your relationship with God, with the church, with other people? How do you kind of come to that relationship?
I've had a lot of kind of grapplings with God, it'd be really nice if I could just have like some solid proof that God like exists. Or I have all these doubts, or I have these like, etc. I have this experience being in community with people, and that's where I feel holiness. Um,
Mm.
but I don't necessarily have a strong conception of like what God looks like or what God feels like or a voice in my head. And I think for a long time growing up, I thought that I was missing something. Like I when I'm praying, it can be hard because I'm like, I don't feel like I'm talking to a person. So
Mm.
therefore, how can it be a conversation? But some of those most profound moments where I felt like a spiritual connection and kind of this idea of my mom has introduced me to this idea of thin spaces where
Mm.
kind of that barrier between spiritual realm or kind of, however you want to describe it, and my earthly experience is a little bit thinner. A lot of
Mhm.
those experiences have been in creation and in spaces where I'm able to focus on my experience with creation more because we're always surrounded by it. But, it's a lot harder when you're surrounded by skyscrapers to focus on the elements of creation, the non-human living elements around us that are actively, not just exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide, but also, energy and life and beauty.
Yeah.
But I think when I'm in a forest or even in the desert. And like at my summer camp growing up, a lot of those moments where I felt immersed in creation is where I felt the spirit. And that
Hmm.
was like my proof. So for me, it's all just intertwined. And I can't care for myself and for others if I'm not caring for, you know, the non-human living elements around me.
That's, I think, a more common experience than people like to talk about. I think you and I both occupy some like very churchy circles and then also some like crunchy, outdoorsy person circles. And in both of those places, I think that there's some pressure to be like, and I experience God on the mountaintop. And when I go into church, it's dead wood and dead books and boring people. Or in the church to be like, yeah, I just feel my spirit lift when I hear a hymn. But of course, those people who are spiritual but not religious and find God in the woods, like they're missing something important. And I think that the reality is that it's more about, I think that they are experiencing something more similar than they give themselves credit for. That there is much more in common with that experience of something indescribable, kind of ineffable, that you and I are both like taking turns not defining well because it's not definable. The reality is that our experience of the holy is so dependent, not dependent, but is so enabled by space, whether that's the sacred space of a sanctuary at church or the sacredness of being in this world that God made. And like take it a step further than being in like a built human environment, being in a grocery store where you're encountering like food that all of that came from dirt at some point in one way or another. And then
Yeah.
it's like cello wrapped in plastic and put into coolers and it goes from being a thing that comes from the earth, a thing that is given to us through creation, to being a commodity that we buy and sell. And that most fundamental relationship that we have with creation of eating food, of drinking water, is mediated through these spaces that kind of separate us from that reality. I'm in Montana. I'm in a agricultural state. I have a lot of farmers in my congregation, and listening to them talk about the experience of cultivating crops that will then feed other people, that will nourish their lives, and the way that that is so deeply ingrained, no pun intended, in their relationship with God and the way that they care for their neighbor, I think is something that as a kid growing up, not spending a lot of time in those spaces was easy to miss. But the reality is, all the stuff that Jesus calls us to do, to care for our neighbor, to feed the hungry, to house the homeless, to clothe the naked, heal the sick, all that stuff requires stuff that comes from the earth
Mm,
and our input. It requires our intelligence, our technology, our ability to think about how to share it, our ability to transform that into something that's more usable in different cases. Like all of that is such a collaboration. It's not just a fully human thing or a fully creation thing. It's the intersection between the two. And I think that we move through this world in a way that really tries to convince us that that separation is natural or
yeah.
normal and or good. Like the idea that the human stuff, the intellect, the spirit is like, if you read Greek guys, this is a big thing for them. Like the idea that your spirit and the material world are opposed to each other.
Mm,
And I think one of the reasons that I'm Christian, that I find the story of Jesus so compelling, is the idea that God sees us making those distinctions between creation and spirit and misunderstanding it. And God goes, all right, listen up. I'm coming in. And God in flesh shows up. And so you want to imagine these things are separate? I don't. God doesn't. So how are we going to move through the world thinking that these things are separate from each other anymore?
yeah.
And I'm hoping that this experience through Lent, the process of taking time apart, special time during the year, to really reflect on our relationships with God, with others, with creation and the things that it produces and the things that we consume can help to grow those thin places, widen those thin places, maybe,
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
more areas of our life feel like that thin space where the divine and the mundane aren't separate anymore.
I think it's no coincidence that a lot of the parables that I grew up hearing from the Bible, and not being I'm not a biblical scholar or like a super well informed theologian, but I think in hearing a lot of the parables that are written into the Bible and the stories that we tell, they're related to sowing seeds, waiting for harvest time, the way that like economies of agriculture as well. Like there's a reason why those stories were resonant at that time. And thinking about what does that mean today? How do we
Mm-hmm.
relate to our understanding of natural cycles? And I think that kind of begs similar questions that we hear in young adult spaces so often is that question that always comes up of where are the young adults? Why aren't they in
Mm-hmm.
church? Where are the young people? They're not doing it the way that we think it should be done.
Mm.
Being a Christian, being a person of faith. Well, actually, the young adults are gathering around things that they care about. They're raising their voices to stand in solidarity and to advocate for people who, are being most affected by the climate crisis or social justice movements, or are out in the woods, like hiking with their
Right.
friends and having conversations about what feels divine or spiritual to them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think there's just some parallels of thinking about our conception of church changes over time. It doesn't look the
Mm-hmm.
same that it looked 2,000 years ago.
Right.
Um, our understanding of natural cycles, our engagement with stories that make sense to us and that make us feel something and drive us to take action in alignment with our values, that has changed over time too. And yet, some still persist. There are
Right.
still parables and stories that feel resonant now. And so I think part of what I'm really looking forward to in this process is hearing our participants, our contributors, um, the stories that they tell and what they bring and how that can resonate with us and just compel us to take action as well.
So I think that this is a good chance for us to transition into closing out this introduction and getting ready for what's going to come down the pike for us. We have some really talented, insightful, wise people who are going to be walking us through kind of each of those individual practices that have come down to us throughout the ages. But I'm curious for you and for me to start us off, what are you thinking about as we go into Lent that you're going to be using to kind of help direct your attention through this season?
So I recently moved, so I'm kind of in a new community that I've lived in before, but as a student, and now
Mhm.
I'm living more in community in the area that I'm at in Tacoma, Washington.
Yeah.
And so I've been attending a new church community, and one thing that's been important to me is having intergenerational conversations, like I mentioned, that has been really resonant for me. Um, but also engaging with the service work of the church and getting to know the neighborhood that I'm living in and why
Mm.
the church emerged and what are some of the like power dynamics at play with where I'm at and how the church responds to that. So it's kind of this nebulous thing, but partially I'm just focusing on engaging with community and in tangible ways,
Mhm.
showing up for there's weekly meals that are opened up to the whole community. And engaging in that, inviting friends to join me in helping prepare those meals and interacting with my community in that way. Um, I'm really excited to engage with the Dismantle devotional that was recently released. That's an anti-white supremacy focus for this Lenten period, and doing that, on my own and having conversations with siblings and friends and gathering to, say the quiet part out loud and grapple with it and talk about it and
Mhm.
confront the things I need to confront in myself. Um, but also back in the Pacific Northwest, I'm really excited to go to local parks more, not just, I love national parks and goodness knows they need our support now more than ever.
Mhm.
Um, but also just like local parks, where are places that people go to, walk around with their families or with their pets, and kind of getting to know my area. That's been kind of my approach as of now. But what about you?
Cool. I love that. I'm resisting the urge. My my thesis was about like the relationship between how we view people and how we view land and how like white supremacy plays into
Mm.
uh, all that from an eco like white supremacy as an eco theology or colonization as an eco theology. So I'm going to restrain myself from diving too much into that right now. But if folks haven't seen the Dismantle program that the ELCA has put together for dismantling white supremacy through Lent, I think that on the surface it might seem like we're pulling in two different directions between creation care and dismantling white supremacy, and we're not actually. I think that those are really closely related. So don't feel like you have to choose one. They feed really well into each other. I think in my personal practice, I'm going to be giving up alcohol because that is always a good thing to just like take a beat and see how your relationship to that goes. And if over 40 days, I'm like, that was harder than I expected it to be, that'll be good room for reflection. And the other thing that I'm going to give up on a fasting level is meat. And not that I think that it's necessarily wrong or immoral to consume meat as a person, but I do think that the way that we do that in the US doesn't look great. I think that there are better ways of doing it, both for the sake of the animals, for the sake of the land that they're cultivated on. There are a lot of ranchers in my area that are pressured by the economics of meat to raise their cattle or treat their land in ways that they don't love, but they have to do in order to make it economically viable. And I think that it's good for me to reflect on my relationship to meat production, meat consumption, and just from a time saving standpoint, if you give up meat for all of Lent, then you have given up meat for more days of the year than like Paul McCartney's Meatless Mondays, or if you were thinking about it as like a 10% tithe
Yeah.
of your time, Lent's more than 10% of the year. So we're knocking it out that way as well. And so if I'm making the choice to eat differently, then I think it'll help shift my relationship to the land that grows the animals, the people that raise them, and the animals that feed us. So those are the things that I'm prioritizing right now. But we might be getting some good ideas from our speakers throughout the season. And there's always time to add stuff in as Lent goes on.
Maybe you could bring back your 3 a.m. prayer.
I could maybe bring back my 3 a.m. prayer. I don't think I'm older now. I don't think my body's gonna like that very much, but we'll find out.
That's fair.
Maybe I'll just add more prayer during my waking hours, and that'll be a better
That's fair.
stewardship of my time. Well, Ellie, I am so pumped to get to go through the season with you, and I'm excited for everyone who's going to be coming alongside us and learning from these really incredible young adults throughout this season. And I'm hoping that people will share with us the ways that they are engaging with their faith and their care for creation throughout this season. But for now, we should leave it off for people to get back to their Ash Wednesday, which is, I think, when this is going to be coming out. And I'll see you again next week as we sit down to talk about prayer with our friend Emmanuel. Until then, I hope you have a good week, and we'll see everyone soon.